teen boy helps lonely veteran fix his fence. Months later, he's standing in front of a cheering crowd. The rhythmic tapping of a hammer echoed through the quiet suburban morning. Through the golden haze of dawn, 16-year-old Marcus Thompson paused his paper route, watching an elderly man struggling with broken fence boards. Colonel James Anderson's trembling hands betrayed both age and deeper wounds, dropping the hammer into dewy grass. Neither knew that this broken fence would bridge 2 generations, unearth buried truths about a fallen soldier, and ignite a battle for justice that would reshape their entire community. Sometimes the deepest connections begin with the simplest words, sir. Would you like some help with that fence? Hey beautiful souls, before we dive in, drop a quick comment with your location and hit that like button. Let's see where everyone's watching from. It means the world to connect with you all. Marcus Thompson stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his paper delivery bag while studying the military portrait of his father that hung proudly on the wall. At 16, he had his father's height and strong features, but never knew the man beyond photographs and medals. Staff Sergeant David Thompson died in a classified operation when Marcus was just 2, leaving behind a void that no military honors could fill and a family trapped in bureaucratic limbo, denied full benefits due to the mission's unofficial status. Living in the modest Pine Grove neighborhood of suburban Philadelphia, Marcus and his mother Sarah made do with what they had. Their small 2-story house, once filled with the promise of a military family's future, now echoed with the quiet determination of survivors. Sarah worked double shifts as a nurse at the VA hospital, her dedication to serving veterans a testament to her unwavering love for her husband's memory. Despite the financial struggle, she ensured Marcus never felt the full weight of their circumstances, though he noticed every extra shift and tired smile. Every morning at 5 a.m., before most of the neighborhood stirred, Marcus would begin his paper route, a job he'd taken not just for the money, but for the solitude it offered. These quiet hours allowed him to imagine conversations with the father he never knew, to dream about the mysteries surrounding his death, and to observe the lives behind every door he passed. He was a thoughtful boy, teachers noted, mature beyond his years, yet carrying an underlying anger that occasionally surfaced in defensive outbursts when other kids mentioned their fathers. At school, Marcus maintained good grades while keeping mostly to himself. His best friend, Tommy Martinez, was the only one who knew the full story about his father, or at least the version Marcus himself knew. The other students saw only a tall, athletic kid who turned down sports team invitations and spent lunch breaks reading military history books in the library. Some teachers whispered about wasted potential, but Marcus had his reasons for staying in the background. The Thompson family's story was complicated by the silence surrounding David's death. Official records stated only that he died in service of his country, but the denial of full benefits and the military's reluctance to provide details suggested something more. Sarah had spent years writing letters, making phone calls, and filing appeals only to face a wall of bureaucratic resistance that left her both frustrated and suspicious. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Marcus developed a deep sense of justice and an instinct to protect the vulnerable. He would step in when younger kids were bullied, help elderly neighbors with their groceries, and volunteer at his mother's VA hospital during summers. These acts of kindness were his way of honoring the father he never knew, a man who, according to the few veterans who would talk about him, never left anyone behind. But beneath Marcus's composed exterior lay questions that burned brighter with each passing year. Why was his father's mission classified? Why did some veterans at the VA hospital give him knowing looks but refuse to speak about his father? And why did his mother sometimes cry over old photos when she thought he wasn't looking? These questions shaped his worldview and drove his keen observation of the people around him, especially the veterans in their neighborhood who seemed to carry similar burdens of silence. The morning paper route became more than just a job. It was his way of mapping the human geography of Pine Grove. He knew which houses held veterans by the flags they flew, which ones struggled with sleepless nights by their early morning lights, and which ones held stories waiting to be told. But no house intrigued him more than the old Victorian at the end of Maple Street, where Colonel James Anderson lived in self-imposed isolation, unaware that his life was about to become inextricably linked with the son of a man he once knew all too well. Colonel James Anderson lived like a ghost in his Victorian house at the end of Maple Street, a structure as weathered and complex as the man himself. At 68, his military bearing remained evident in his straight spine and measured steps, though his hands now trembled with a combination of age, trauma, and the weight of secrets he'd carried for decades. The pristine Marine Corps flag hung daily outside his home, the only consistent sign that the property was inhabited at all. 25 years of Marine Corps service had left their mark on James, both in the medals carefully stored in his attic and the nightmares that regularly woke him at 03000 hours. His last mission, classified and controversial, had ended with a helicopter crash in hostile territory, taking the lives of 3 men under his command, including Staff Sergeant David Thompson. The official reports were sanitized, the truth buried under layers of national security, leaving James to carry the burden of what really happened that night. The neighborhood knew little about the colonel, their speculation ranging from respected veteran to paranoid recluse. Children whispered stories about the crazy old Marine, while adults noticed how he attended every local Memorial Day service but stood apart from the crowd, his eyes fixed on something distant only he could see. Few knew that he spent his sleepless nights writing detailed letters to the families of every man he'd lost in combat, letters he never sent, but kept in a growing collection of leather-bound journals. James's isolation wasn't merely preference, it was penance. The classified nature of his final mission prevented him from providing closure to the families of his fallen men, particularly young Thompson's widow and child. He'd watched from afar as Sarah Thompson fought for benefits as young Marcus grew into his father's image, powerless to help without compromising national security or revealing his own role in the tragedy. The guilt manifested in his meticulous maintenance of military records, newspaper clippings, and surveillance of the Thompson family from a distance, his way of keeping his promise to a dead man. The Victorian house itself reflected its owner's state of mind. The interior was organized with military precision, photos of his former units arranged chronologically, books alphabetized, surfaces dust-free. But the exterior had begun to show signs of neglect, particularly the wooden fence that he now struggled to maintain with aging hands. His pride prevented him from hiring help, just as it prevented him from seeking treatment for his PTSD at the VA hospital where Sarah Thompson worked. Recently, James had noticed increased activity in the neighborhood, real estate agents making frequent appearances, developers studying property lines, and whispered conversations about progress and renewal. Richard Maxwell, a former Marine-turned-real estate mogul, had been buying up properties, his aggressive tactics particularly focused on homes owned by aging veterans. James recognized Maxwell from their shared military past and from darker chapters that connected to that final fatal mission. The colonel's daily routine rarely varied. Wake at 0500, coffee black, scan multiple newspapers for any mention of military operations or veterans affairs, maintain his personal archives, and observe the neighborhood from his second-floor study. He noticed everything: Marcus Thompson's paper route, Sarah's early morning departures for the hospital, the gradual changes in the community he'd chosen for its proximity to the family he felt duty-bound to protect from afar. But lately, his windowsill observations had revealed troubling patterns. Maxwell's representatives targeting vulnerable veterans, mysterious accidents forcing property sales, and a systematic erasure of the military community that had defined Pine Grove for generations. James knew he held evidence that could expose Maxwell's corruption, both past and present, but revealing it would mean confronting his own role in the cascade of events that had shaped so many lives. As he watched young Marcus Thompson pass by each morning, James felt the weight of his secrets growing heavier. The boy's resemblance to his father was uncanny, down to the way he carried himself with quiet dignity. The colonel knew that soon the carefully constructed walls between past and present would crumble. It was only a matter of time before truth, justice, and redemption would demand their due. The morning that changed everything began like any other on Marcus's paper route, with dawn barely breaking over Pine Grove's sleepy streets. The rhythmic thud of newspapers hitting porches was interrupted by an unfamiliar sound, the irregular tapping of a hammer and occasional muttered curses from Colonel Anderson's property. Marcus paused, his delivery bag still half full, watching the elderly Marine struggle with rotting fence posts. The old wooden fence, once a proud boundary marking the colonel's territory, had finally surrendered to years of weather and neglect. James Anderson stood there, his military posture betrayed by trembling hands as he attempted to secure a loose board. His tool belt seemed too heavy for his thin frame, and the morning dew had made the wooden panels slick and uncooperative. Marcus found himself moving closer, drawn by something more than mere curiosity. Perhaps it was the way the colonel's hand shook, reminiscent of some veterans at his mother's hospital, or maybe it was the quiet dignity in the man's struggle against both time and gravity. When the hammer slipped from the colonel's grasp, clattering into the dewy grass, Marcus's feet carried him forward before his mind could object. Sir Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Would you like some help with that fence?" The words hung in the air between them, bridging decades of silence and separation. Colonel Anderson turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they focused on the tall teenager before him. For a moment he seemed to see a ghost David Thompson's son, standing there with his father's bearing and concerned expression. The colonel's initial instinct was to refuse, pride warring with practicality. But as he bent to retrieve the fallen hammer, his back protesting the movement, something in Marcus's earnest expression gave him pause. "You know anything about fence repair, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Marcus stepped closer, picking up the hammer before the colonel could reach it. "My mom's boyfriend taught me some basic carpentry before he moved away," Marcus replied, carefully omitting that this had been 3 boyfriends and 4 years ago. "I help Mrs. Martinez with her garden fence sometimes." He offered the hammer back, handle first. The way he'd learned tools should always be passed. The colonel studied Marcus for a long moment, seeing both the boy before him and the man he'd known years ago. Finally he nodded. "Well, if you've got the time, I could use an extra pair of steady hands." The acceptance came harder than the words suggested, but something about the moment felt ordained, as if all the years of watching from afar had led to this precise intersection of lives. They worked in companionable silence at first, falling into an efficient rhythm. Marcus held boards steady while the colonel marked them for cutting, and together they began replacing the rotted sections with new lumber the colonel had ready. Occasionally James would offer quiet instruction, his military precision evident in even this civilian task. As the morning progressed, neighbors began to take notice. Some slowed their cars passing by, unused to seeing the reclusive colonel engaging with anyone, let alone a teenager. Mrs. Chen, walking her poodle, stopped to watch with undisguised interest. Marcus could feel the weight of their attention but focused on the task at hand, learning more about proper angles and support posts than he'd expected. The colonel, too, found himself gradually relaxing into the unexpected companionship. The boy's questions were thoughtful, his work careful and methodical. When Marcus suggested a modification to improve drainage around the posts, James found himself impressed by the practical intelligence behind the recommendation. As the sun climbed higher and the morning paper route deadline approached, Marcus reluctantly began gathering his things. "I should finish my route, sir," he said, brushing sawdust from his clothes, "but I could come back tomorrow if you'd like help finishing up." The offer was genuine, sparked by something more than mere politeness. Colonel Anderson straightened up, surveying their morning's work. The partially repaired fence stood as physical evidence of an unexpected connection, a breach in the carefully constructed walls he'd maintained for years. "Same time tomorrow, then," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the strange mix of anticipation and anxiety churning in his gut. As Marcus headed off to complete his route, neither man fully understood that they had just laid the foundation for something far more significant than a simple fence repair. As Marcus continued his morning appearances at the colonel's house, the quiet neighborhood of Pine Grove began buzzing with speculation. Most mornings now found them working side by side, their routine expanding beyond fence repair to general yard maintenance and even basic house repairs. But beneath this growing connection, darker currents were stirring in the community. Richard Maxwell's sleek black SUV had become an increasingly common sight on Maple Street, his real estate company's signs sprouting like invasive weeds across the neighborhood. Maxwell Development's latest project, Pine Grove Renaissance, promised to transform the aging suburb into a modern residential paradise, complete with luxury condominiums and upscale shopping centers. The glossy brochures made no mention of what would happen to the current residents, particularly the aging veterans who'd called Pine Grove home for decades. One morning, as Marcus and the colonel worked on reinforcing a corner post, Maxwell himself appeared at the fence line. His tailored suit and practiced smile seemed out of place among the sawdust and dirt. "Jim," he called out, using a familiarity that made the colonel's shoulders stiffen. I see you're fixing up the old place, though I have to wonder if it's worth the effort, given our earlier discussions." Marcus noticed how the colonel's hand tightened on his hammer, knuckles whitening. "No discussions to be had," Maxwell James replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only comes from years of military command. "My answer hasn't changed. The tension between the two men crackled like static before a storm." Maxwell's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened as they swept over Marcus. "And who's this young man? Interesting choice of help, Jim. He looks remarkably like the deliberate pause hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning." The colonel stepped forward, positioning himself between Maxwell and Marcus. "The boy's just helping with repairs, nothing more." But Marcus had caught the exchange, noting both Maxwell's insinuation and the colonel's protective response. As Maxwell departed with a too-casual wave, Marcus observed how several other properties on the street already bore sold signs, all homes belonging to elderly veterans. Mrs. Rivera, whose husband had served in Vietnam, had tearfully packed up just last week after 40 years in her home. Later that morning, as they broke for water, Marcus finally voiced the question that had been building. "Sir, what did Mr. Maxwell mean about me looking like someone?" The colonel's hand stilled on his water bottle, his expression distant. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted down the street. Old Mr. Peterson, another veteran, was engaged in a heated argument with two men in suits, more of Maxwell's representatives. "You can't just change the terms like this," Peterson's voice carried clearly, his frustration evident. "We had an agreement." The suited men's responses were too low to hear, but their body language spoke of practiced intimidation. The colonel watched the scene unfold, his jaw tightening. Marcus saw something flash across the older man's face: recognition, perhaps, or a deeper understanding of what was really happening in Pine Grove. "Sir," Marcus prompted, but James shook his head slightly, his expression closing off. "Some battles, son, take more preparation than others," he finally said, his voice low and measured. "And some enemies wear suits instead of uniforms." He turned to face Marcus fully, studying him with an intensity that felt like recognition. "Tell me, how much do you know about your father?" The question caught Marcus off guard, seeming both out of place and somehow perfectly timed. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed a text from his mother asking where he was, worry evident in her multiple question marks. The colonel noticed Marcus's expression and nodded. "Go on home, son. But tomorrow, if you're willing, I think it's time for some history lessons that won't be found in your school books." As Marcus gathered his things, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was shifting: the neighborhood, the colonel's demeanor, his understanding of his own past. Walking home, he passed more for sale signs, each one seeming like a surrender flag, and what he was beginning to realize was more than just a real estate developer's ambitious project. Something bigger was unfolding in Pine Grove, and somehow his father's memory was tangled up in it all. Young Marcus deserves every like for his kindness in helping that elderly veteran, yet sadly our hero hasn't received the recognition he deserves. If you think he's earned it, let's show him some love with a simple tap on that like button. The next morning arrived heavy with anticipation. Marcus found the colonel in his study, a room that felt frozen in time, with military memorabilia and maps covering every wall. James Anderson sat behind a solid oak desk, a leather-bound album open before him. "Close the door, son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of silence. As Marcus approached, his eyes were drawn to a photograph lying atop the album. The image, worn at the edges but still clear, showed a group of Marines in desert combat gear. His breath caught as he recognized a familiar face: his father, younger and alive, standing next to a younger Colonel Anderson. Both men wore the confident smiles of soldiers who still believed in clear-cut missions and happy endings. "Your father was the finest staff sergeant I ever commanded," the colonel began, his fingers tracing the photograph's edge. This was taken 3 days before his voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them like smoke. Marcus found himself gripping the edge of the desk, his knuckles white with tension. The colonel opened a drawer, removing a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "I've written this letter 100 times over the years," he said, "but could never bring myself to deliver it to your mother." His hands trembled as he broke the seal. "The official story about your father's death, it wasn't the whole truth." Marcus sank into a leather chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The colonel continued, each word measured and heavy with regret. We were on a classified operation, tracking a group that was selling military intelligence. One of our own had gone rogue, someone high-ranking, someone we trusted. His eyes flickered to the window, where Maxwell's latest Pine Grove Renaissance billboard was visible in the distance. Your father discovered something he wasn't supposed to find, James continued. Documents proving corruption at the highest levels. He was going to report it, but the colonel's voice cracked. The helicopter crash wasn't an accident, Marcus, and the man responsible has spent years building his empire on the blood money from that operation. Marcus felt the room spinning, his father's portrait on the wall seeming to watch him with new intensity. Maxwell, he whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. The colonel nodded grimly. The same man who's now trying to force out every veteran in Pine Grove, many of whom served with your father. Standing abruptly, James moved to a large safe hidden behind a painting. The combination lock clicked softly as he worked it with practiced movements. Your father managed to hide the evidence before he died. Gave it to me for safekeeping, made me promise to use it if things ever went too far. The safe door swung open, revealing stacks of documents and a sealed USB drive. Why now? Marcus asked, his voice barely steady. Why tell me after all these years? The colonel turned, his military bearing momentarily crumbling under the weight of guilt. Because history's repeating itself, son. Maxwell's using the same tactics here in Pine Grove, threatening veterans, forcing them out, corrupting the system. And because, he paused, meeting Marcus's eyes directly, because you have your father's strength and I'm tired of carrying this burden alone. A sudden knock at the study door made both of them jump. Sarah Thompson's voice called through the wood, Marcus. Are you in there? The colonel quickly secured the safe, his movements precise despite his shaking hands. Marcus stood frozen, torn between the truth he'd just learned and his mother's worried tone. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow, James said quietly, straightening his posture. But Marcus, be careful. Maxwell has eyes everywhere, and he's already noticed our connection. He gathered the photographs, hesitated, then handed one to Marcus, the image of his father and the colonel together. Your father was a hero, son. It's time the world knew that. As Marcus left the study to face his concerned mother, the photograph burned in his pocket like a live coal. The colonel watched from his window as Sarah led her son away, her protective arm around his shoulders, reminding him painfully of another parent who'd never made it home. The truth was out now, at least part of it, and James Anderson knew there would be no turning back from what was about to unfold in Pine Grove. The impact of the colonel's revelation rippled through Pine Grove like aftershocks from an earthquake. Within days, Maxwell Development's presence intensified dramatically. Black SUVs cruised the streets more frequently, and more for sale signs appeared overnight. The community's transformation was accelerating, but now carried a sinister undertone that only a few could fully comprehend. At an emergency neighborhood meeting held in the local church basement, the tension was palpable. Veterans and longtime residents packed the room, their faces drawn with worry. Maxwell himself stood at the podium, his charisma on full display as he presented glossy renderings of the proposed development. Pine Grove Renaissance isn't just about progress, he announced, his smile never reaching his eyes. It's about honoring our community's military heritage while embracing the future. From his position near the back, Marcus watched the colonel's face darken at these words. Several rows ahead, Sarah Thompson sat rigid, her nurse's uniform still on from her shift. The irony of Maxwell speaking about military heritage wasn't lost on anyone who knew the truth, but they remained silent, the weight of classified secrets holding their tongues. We're offering fair market value for all properties, Maxwell continued smoothly. With additional considerations for our veteran residents, his gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on the colonel. After all, we understand sacrifice. The last word seemed to hover in the air like a threat. Mrs. Rivera stood up, her voice shaking but determined. Fair market value won't find us new homes in this area, she protested. Where are we supposed to go? Others joined in, their concerns creating a chorus of dissent. Maxwell's team of suits moved through the crowd, offering individual consultations, effectively breaking up the united front of resistance. Outside after the meeting, a small group gathered around the colonel. James Anderson had become an unofficial leader of the opposition, his military reputation lending weight to the resistance. We need to organize, he declared, passing out handwritten contact lists. Document everything. Every threat, every accident, every sudden change in property evaluations. Marcus, standing at his mother's side, noticed movement in the shadows of the church parking lot. Men in dark suits were photographing the gathering, making no effort to hide their surveillance. Sarah pulled him closer, her protective instinct flaring. "Maybe we should head home," she whispered, but Marcus stood his ground. The next morning brought the first real casualties of the escalating conflict. Old Mr. Peterson's garage had mysteriously caught fire overnight, destroying boxes of military records he'd been safeguarding for years. 2 blocks over, Mrs. Martinez found her front garden bulldozed, a utility company mistake that conveniently destroyed her prize roses and decreased her property's curb appeal. The colonel's response was swift and strategic. He converted his study into a command center, gathering evidence and collecting testimonies. Veterans from neighboring communities began showing up at his door, sharing similar stories of intimidation and forced sales. Each account added another piece to a puzzle that stretched back decades. Sarah Thompson, initially hesitant about Marcus's involvement with the colonel, found herself drawn into the resistance. Her position at the VA hospital had exposed her to countless stories of veterans being displaced. "It's not just Pine Grove," she realized one evening, spreading out a map marked with Maxwell development projects. "It's systematic, targeting military communities specifically." The turning point came when Maxwell's team submitted their final proposal to the city council. The development plan revealed that the entire Veterans Memorial Park dedicated to fallen soldiers, including David Thompson, would be replaced by a shopping center. The community's outrage was immediate and vocal. Marcus, watching his mother and the colonel pore over documents late into the night, felt the weight of his father's photograph in his pocket. The truth about his death was now inextricably linked to Pine Grove's future. What had started as a simple fence repair had evolved into a battle for justice, both for his father and for an entire community. The colonel caught Marcus's expression and nodded grimly. "Sometimes," he said, "the biggest wars are fought right at home." Sarah looked up from her papers, seeing her husband's determination mirrored in her son's face. The lines had been drawn, and Pine Grove was about to become a battleground where the weapons would be truth, memory, and the unshakable bonds of a community under siege. The transformation of Colonel Anderson's Victorian house into the resistance headquarters happened gradually but purposefully. The study, once a shrine to military memories, now hummed with activity as veterans and residents came and went, each bringing new pieces to the expanding puzzle of Maxwell's operations. Maps covered the walls, red pins marking properties already lost, yellow ones indicating homes under pressure, creating a visual representation of a community under siege. Marcus spent every free hour there, absorbing stories and connections. The colonel had become both mentor and historian, teaching him to see patterns in seemingly unrelated events. In military intelligence, James would explain, it's not just about collecting information, it's about understanding how it all connects together. They built a timeline that stretched from the fatal helicopter crash to Maxwell's current campaign of acquisition. Sarah Thompson's involvement deepened as well, her nursing schedule arranged to allow for evening strategy sessions. Her access to VA hospital records proved invaluable, revealing a pattern of veteran displacement that stretched across multiple states. One evening, reviewing files spread across the dining room table, she discovered something disturbing. The veterans being targeted, she noted, they're all connected to that final mission, either directly or through their units. The colonel's face darkened at this revelation. Maxwell's not just building an empire, he concluded. He's erasing evidence. The implications hung heavy in the room. Every displaced veteran, every lost home, represented another thread of truth being snipped away. Marcus thought of the USB drive still hidden in the colonel's safe, wondering how many lives had been ruined to keep its contents secret. As their investigation deepened, so did the bond between Marcus and the colonel. During quiet moments, James would share stories about David Thompson, not just as a soldier, but as a man. Your father had this way of finding humor even in the darkest situations. He'd recall, his voice warm with memory. The night before that final mission, he showed me pictures of you, said he was fighting for your future. These moments helped Marcus piece together the father he'd never known, transforming a fallen hero into a real person. The community began to rally around their cause. Mrs. Chin, whose restaurant had been a neighborhood fixture for decades, offered her back room for secret meetings. Veterans from surrounding areas brought their own stories and evidence, each account adding weight to their case. Even some of Maxwell's former employees, troubled by conscience, began passing information through anonymous channels. One crucial breakthrough came from Tommy Martinez, Marcus's best friend and an aspiring computer whiz. Analyzing property records, he discovered a pattern of shell companies, all leading back to Maxwell Development. "Look at the dates," Tommy pointed out, highlighting transactions on his laptop screen. "Each major property acquisition follows a mysterious accident or incident within days." The colonel studied these findings with growing concern. Maxwell's gotten bolder over the years, he observed. Back then, he covered his tracks carefully. Now he's practically flaunting his power. The change in tactics suggested either growing confidence or increasing desperation. Neither boded well for Pine Grove. Sarah noticed changes in her son during this period. Marcus carried himself differently, his father's sense of justice now fully awakened. She found him late one night, poring over military history books, teaching himself about strategy and resistance. "Mom," he asked, looking up with eyes that seemed older than his years, "do you think Dad would be proud of what we're doing?" She sat beside him, touching the worn photograph he kept with him always. "Your father fought for truth," she replied softly. "He'd be proud to see you doing the same." The moment was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Mrs. Rivera, trembling with news that Maxwell's men had been seen around the colonel's house after dark. The stakes were escalating. The colonel began implementing security measures, teaching Marcus and others basic surveillance detection and counter-surveillance techniques. Knowledge is power, he'd say, but it's also a target. They installed security cameras, established code words, and created emergency protocols. What had started as a community protest was evolving into something that felt more like a military operation. The breakthrough they needed came from an unexpected source. A junior employee at Maxwell Development, troubled by conscience, reached out through Mrs. Chen's grandson. The documents they provided confirmed their suspicions. Maxwell wasn't just buying properties, he was systematically targeting homes of veterans connected to that fatal mission, using pressure tactics that barely stayed within legal bounds. As Marcus helped the colonel organize this new evidence, a pattern emerged that chilled them both. The veterans being forced out weren't random, they were specifically those who might have knowledge of Maxwell's past activities. Pine Grove wasn't just another development project, it was the final stage of a cover-up decades in the making. "We need to move carefully now," the colonel cautioned, securing the new documents in his safe. "Maxwell spent years building this house of cards. When it falls, he'll fall with it, and men like that don't go down easily." Marcus nodded, understanding that they were past the point of simple community activism. This was about justice, truth, and honoring the sacrifices of those who'd fought for both. The retaliation began subtly at first. Marcus's morning paper route was interrupted by mysterious car troubles, slashed tires, sugar in the gas tank. Sarah found her nursing schedule suddenly rearranged, assigned to impossible shifts. The colonel's property suffered a series of random vandalism incidents, each one more aggressive than the last. Maxwell's influence ran deeper than they'd imagined. Local news outlets declined to cover their protests. City council members became suddenly unavailable for meetings. Even the police responded with suspicious slowness to calls from Pine Grove residents. The community found itself isolated, fighting an enemy that seemed to control every official channel of resistance. One evening, as Marcus and the colonel reviewed security footage of Maxwell's men photographing visitors to the house, Sarah burst in with troubling news. "They're accessing patient records at the VA," she reported, her hands shaking. "Veterans who've spoken out are having their benefits questioned, their treatments delayed." The systematic intimidation was expanding, targeting not just properties but livelihoods. The colonel's face hardened at this news. Using veterans' health care as leverage, that's a new low. Even for Maxwell, he pulled out a worn notebook, adding this latest tactic to their growing evidence. But as he wrote, Marcus noticed something unusual about his mentor's hands. They weren't trembling anymore. The more intense the pressure became, the more the old Marine seemed to come alive, as if decades of guilt and inaction were falling away. Their evidence cache grew steadily, but so did the risks. Tommy Martinez's laptop was stolen after he uncovered financial connections between Maxwell Development and offshore accounts. Mrs. Chen's restaurant suffered a series of health code violations that couldn't be coincidental. Each act of intimidation carried a clear message: back off or face the consequences. The psychological warfare escalated. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes detailing personal information that should have been private. Late-night phone calls filled with silence kept residents on edge. Cars with tinted windows parked outside homes for hours, their occupants watching and photographing. The community began to feel like a war zone, with invisible battle lines drawn through once peaceful streets. Sarah noticed the toll it was taking on Marcus. Her son's eyes carried a new wariness, his movements more calculated. He'd inherited his father's sense of justice, but she worried he was also inheriting the burden that had ultimately led to David's death. Late one night, finding him studying surveillance footage instead of sleeping, she confronted her fears. "You don't have to carry this weight alone," she said softly. Marcus turned to her, his father's determination evident in his expression. "Dad didn't back down," he replied. "Neither will I." The simple statement carried echoes of David Thompson's last days, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. History seemed to be repeating itself, but this time she was watching it happen with clear eyes. The colonel recognized the pattern too. One afternoon, after another threatening visit from Maxwell's lawyers, he pulled Marcus aside. "Your father had the same look," he said gravely, "when he first discovered the truth. But this time we're not fighting alone." He opened his safe, removing not just the USB drive but stacks of additional documentation, insurance policies of sorts, spread across multiple locations. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Mrs. Rivera's grandson, a law student, identified a pattern in Maxwell's property acquisitions that violated federal regulations regarding veteran housing rights. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. The colonel's evidence, combined with this legal angle, could potentially bring down the entire operation. But victory wouldn't come easily. The night after they filed their first legal briefs, the colonel's house was broken into. The safe remained secure, but the message was clear: Maxwell was done playing games. The community responded by organizing night watches, veterans taking shifts to patrol the streets of their threatened neighborhood. As tensions mounted, Marcus discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in his father's old service records, which Sarah had kept sealed for years, was a coded message, coordinates leading to additional evidence David Thompson had hidden before his death. The colonel studied the discovery with mixed emotion. "Your father was always thinking ahead," he said quietly. "He knew someday someone would need to finish what he started." The danger was growing by the day, but so was their resolve. The once quiet neighborhood had transformed into a fortress of solidarity. Veterans shared security duties, families looked out for each other, and every act of intimidation was met with documented resistance. They were no longer just fighting for their homes, they were fighting for justice long delayed. As Marcus watched the colonel coordinate their growing resistance movement, he understood why his father had trusted this man with the truth. Despite years of hiding from his past, James Anderson had found his redemption in leading this fight. The trembling hands that had once struggled with a hammer now moved with purpose and precision, mapping out strategies to protect their community and expose Maxwell's corruption. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either save Pine Grove or destroy it completely. Maxwell's deadline for property acquisitions was approaching, and his tactics were becoming more aggressive. But in his desperate push to bury the past, he had unleashed something unexpected: a community united by truth, bound together by shared purpose, and led by the unlikely partnership of a teenage boy and an old Marine, both carrying the legacy of a fallen hero. The Veterans Day ceremony was Pine Grove's last stand. The colonel had chosen the date deliberately, a day when the community's military heritage couldn't be ignored, when media attention would be at its peak, and when Maxwell's true nature would be exposed before the largest possible audience. The park, still standing despite Maxwell's plans to replace it with a shopping center, filled with residents and supporters from across the state. Marcus stood at the podium, his heart pounding but his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "We gather today not just to honor veterans," he began, "but to fight for their right to keep their homes, their dignity, and their truth." Behind him sat rows of elderly veterans, including the colonel, each wearing their service medals. Sarah Thompson watched from the front row, her eyes bright with tears and pride. The ceremony had been meticulously planned. Local media, finally convinced by the scale of the story, positioned their cameras strategically. Mrs. Chen's grandson live-streamed the event. ensuring that even if traditional media backed out, the truth would still reach the public. Veterans from neighboring communities had arrived in force, creating a sea of military caps and determined faces. As Marcus continued his speech, movement at the park's entrance caught his attention. Maxwell had arrived, flanked by his usual entourage of lawyers and security. The developer's face darkened as he surveyed the scene. This wasn't the quiet submission he'd expected from Pine Grove. The colonel gave Marcus a subtle nod, signaling to proceed with their plan. Pine Grove isn't just about properties and profits, Marcus declared, his voice growing stronger. It's about people who served their country, who carried secrets and scars, who deserved better than to be pushed out of their homes by the very corruption they once fought against. He pulled out his father's photograph, holding it up for all to see. This is Staff Sergeant David Thompson, my father, who died protecting the truth about corruption within our military ranks. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maxwell stepped forward, his lawyers already moving to intervene, but they were too late. The colonel rose from his seat, walking steadily to join Marcus at the podium. "For years I've carried the burden of silence," James Anderson announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Today that silence ends." One by one, veterans in the crowd stood as the colonel began detailing Maxwell's decades-long campaign of corruption. Each stood as their name was called, each representing a piece of the puzzle they'd assembled. Mrs. Rivera with property theft documentation. Mr. Peterson with evidence of orchestrated accidents. Former Maxwell Development employees with internal documents proving systematic targeting of veteran homeowners. Marcus watched Maxwell's face change as the evidence mounted. The developer's usual smooth confidence cracked, revealing glimpses of the desperate man beneath. When the colonel reached the part about the helicopter crash, Maxwell's hand moved toward his jacket, causing several veterans to tense. But he only pulled out his phone, barking urgent orders to someone on the other end. The response was immediate. Police cars appeared at the park entrances, but not for the reasons Maxwell expected. Led by a deputy whose father had lost his home to Maxwell Development, they moved not toward the podium but toward Maxwell himself. The evidence compiled by Pine Grove's residents had finally reached the right authorities. Sarah Thompson stepped forward then, adding her voice to the testimony. She spoke of years fighting for benefits denied, of veterans pressured out of their homes while battling PTSD, of a community that refused to be silenced. Her presence beside Marcus completed a picture of family strength that resonated deeply with the gathered crowd. The ceremony transformed into something more powerful than a mere protest. It became a moment of collective healing, of long-held secrets finally seeing daylight. Veterans in the audience began sharing their own stories, creating a tapestry of testimony that no amount of legal maneuvering could unravel. Maxwell's empire of silence was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to thousands. But as the colonel prepared to reveal the contents of the USB drive, the final piece of evidence his father had sacrificed everything to protect, Marcus noticed sudden movement in the crowd. Maxwell's security team was advancing, their intentions clear in their determined expressions. The colonel saw it too, positioning himself protectively near Marcus while continuing his revelation. The tension in the park reached a breaking point. Maxwell's men versus rows of veterans, many elderly but all standing firm, protecting the podium where truth was finally being spoken. News cameras swiveled to capture the confrontation, ensuring that whatever happened next would be witnessed by the world. In that moment, Pine Grove stood united, ready to defend not just their homes but the very principles their community was built upon. The confrontation exploded into chaos when Maxwell himself surged forward, his composed businessman facade completely shattered. "Anderson," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation, "you have no idea what you're doing." The colonel stood his ground, one hand protectively on Marcus's shoulder, the other holding the USB drive that contained 2 decades of damning evidence. Maxwell's security team moved with practiced precision, but they found themselves facing an unexpected obstacle. The veterans in the crowd, despite their age, formed a human barrier around the podium. Mrs. Rivera's son, a current Marine on leave, coordinated their defense with military efficiency. Even Mrs. Chin, barely 5 feet tall, planted herself firmly in the security team's path, her chin raised in defiance. The colonel's voice cut through the chaos, amplified by the podium's microphone. "It ends today, Richard," he declared, connecting his laptop to the presentation screen. the same way it should have ended 20 years ago. The giant display flickered to life, showing documents that made Maxwell's face drain of color. Financial records, classified mission details, and photographs began scrolling across the screen. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the full scope of Maxwell's corruption unfolded. The helicopter crash that killed his father wasn't just about silencing one whistleblower, it was about protecting a massive network of military contract fraud, property theft, and systematic exploitation of veteran benefits. The evidence his father had discovered went far beyond Pine Grove, implicating high-ranking officials and revealing millions in stolen funds. Sarah Thompson's gasp was audible when her husband's final mission report appeared on screen, unredacted for the first time. David Thompson had documented everything, knowing the risks, preparing for the worst. His final message, embedded in the files, played across the speakers. To those who find this make it right, Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he heard his father's voice for the first time in his memory. Maxwell made one last desperate move. "You think exposing this helps anyone?" he snarled, pulling out a stack of documents from his briefcase. "How many careers will be ruined? How many families destroyed? The system works because people like me make it work." He threw the papers into the air, but instead of creating confusion, they only added to his evidence of guilt. The colonel remained unmoved. "The system works because of people like David Thompson," he corrected, "who gave their lives to protect it from people like you." As if on cue, federal agents emerged from the crowd, their badges glinting in the sunlight. Maxwell's security team, reading the situation, stepped back with their hands raised. But Maxwell wasn't finished. In a final act of desperation, he lunged for the laptop, intent on destroying the evidence. Marcus reacted instinctively, moving to protect the computer. The colonel intercepted Maxwell, and for a moment, the two old Marines grappled at the podium's edge. Despite his age, James Anderson's training hadn't deserted him. He subdued Maxwell with a precision that spoke of years of combat experience. As federal agents led Maxwell away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Marcus. "You're just like your father," he spat, "too righteous to understand how the world really works." Marcus stood taller, his father's photo still in his hand. "I'll take that as a compliment," he replied, his voice steady and clear. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but the celebration was tempered by the weight of the moment. Veterans hugged each other, many crying openly as decades of injustice finally found resolution. The colonel turned to Marcus and Sarah, his military bearing finally softening. "David would be proud," he said simply, enveloping them both in a rare embrace. Local news reporters swarmed forward, eager to capture the story that would soon make national headlines. But amid the chaos, Marcus noticed something profound. The veterans of Pine Grove stood straighter, their shoulders squared, as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted. The truth had done more than expose corruption, it had restored dignity to those who had carried the weight of silence for far too long. The colonel addressed the crowd one final time, his voice thick with emotion. "Today we honor not just our veterans," he declared, "but the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." He gestured to the park around them, to the homes that would now remain in the hands of those who had earned them. "This is what we fought for, not just territory, but truth. Not just victory, but justice." As the sun set over Pine Grove that evening, casting long shadows across the park that would now remain a memorial, Marcus realized that the community had won more than just their homes. They had reclaimed their voice, their dignity, and their right to remember. The fence that had once divided him from the colonel now stood as a symbol of the bridges that truth could build, even across generations. In moments like these, where truth and justice prevail, we're reminded of the power of standing together. If this story touched your heart, join our community by subscribing. Together we'll share more inspiring tales of courage, honor, and the triumph of the human spirit. The victory at the park proved to be just the beginning of a darker chapter. Within days of Maxwell's arrest, Pine Grove felt the ripple effects of disturbing his powerful network. The colonel's house was broken into again, this time with devastating efficiency. The safe was professionally cracked, its contents scattered and partially destroyed. More troubling were the missing file-specific documents that could implicate higher-ranking officials. James Anderson knew immediately what it meant. "They're cleaning house," he told Marcus and Sarah grimly, surveying the damage. Maxwell was just the visible part of the iceberg. The break-in wasn't reported to the police. They'd learned the hard way that some officers were still loyal to Maxwell's interests. The attacks escalated rapidly. Veterans who had testified at the ceremony found their VA benefits suddenly under review. Mrs. Chen's restaurant failed another health inspection, forcing her to close temporarily. Mr. Peterson's garage was burned to the ground, destroying the remaining evidence he'd kept hidden for years. The colonel took these blows personally, his renewed sense of purpose crumbling under the weight of responsibility. The tremors in his hands returned, worse than before. Late one night, Marcus found him in the study, surrounded by scattered papers, muttering about connections they'd missed. "I should have seen it coming," he repeated, his voice haunted, "just like with your father." The media, initially supportive, began publishing articles questioning the veterans' claims. Anonymous sources suggested that age and PTSD had made their testimonies unreliable. The story was being rewritten before their eyes, truth buried under layers of carefully crafted doubt. Sarah noticed the change in her son first. The confident young man who had stood at the podium was replaced by someone who jumped at shadows, who checked over his shoulder constantly. When his bike was vandalized with threatening messages, she insisted he stop his paper route. The morning quiet of Pine Grove, once peaceful, now felt ominous. The colonel's health began to deteriorate under the stress. His PTSD episodes, long managed through routine and purpose, returned with devastating force. During one particularly bad moment, he mistook Marcus for David Thompson, begging forgiveness for not saving him. The episode left both Marcus and the colonel shaken, their bond tested by the ghosts of the past. The community's unity began to fracture. Some residents, worn down by constant pressure, began to question whether the fight was worth it. Others, facing financial ruin from legal fees and property damage, couldn't afford to maintain their resistance. The dream of preserving Pine Grove seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a nightmare of intimidation and fear. One rainy evening, as Marcus helped the colonel reorganize what remained of their evidence, they discovered a pattern in the attacks. Every person targeted had a connection to a specific mission, not the one that killed David Thompson, but something earlier, something even more classified. The colonel's face went ash white at the revelation. "This goes deeper than Maxwell," he whispered, his hands shaking as he connected dates and names. "We've stumbled onto something bigger, something that could—" His voice trailed off as headlights swept across the study windows. Multiple vehicles were pulling up outside, their engines cutting off in synchronized precision. Before Marcus could react, the colonel was moving with surprising speed, gathering specific documents and shoving them into his hands. "Get to your mother," he ordered, his voice carrying the sharp edge of command. "Don't stop, don't look back. Some battles can't be won head-on." As Marcus slipped out the back door into the rain, he heard the front door splinter open. The last glimpse he had of Colonel James Anderson was of the old Marine standing straight-backed in his study, facing the intruders with the same dignity he'd shown on the battlefield decades ago. The sound of breaking glass and muffled violence followed Marcus as he ran through the darkness, his father's legacy and the colonel's trust clutched tightly against his chest, the rain mixing with tears he couldn't afford to acknowledge. Pine Grove's victory had been an illusion. The real war was just beginning. The colonel's hospitalization made the local news, described clinically as an apparent home invasion. Sarah Thompson, using her position at the VA hospital, managed to get him transferred to a secure ward, but his condition was critical. The official police report listed his injuries as consistent with a fall, ignoring the obvious signs of a professional assault. Marcus spent his evenings in the hospital corridor, watching through the window as machines kept track of the colonel's vital signs. The documents he'd saved that night were hidden now, their contents revealing a web of corruption that made Maxwell's schemes look amateur in comparison. Sarah noticed how her son's hands had developed the same tremor that had plagued the colonel, trauma passing between generations like a toxic inheritance. Pine Grove descended into an atmosphere of defeated silence. The veterans who had stood proudly at the ceremony now hurried between their homes with downturned faces, blinds drawn, security systems armed. Mrs. Rivera found her son's military service record mysteriously flagged for review. The Martinez family's home insurance was suddenly canceled. Each day brought new forms of subtle retaliation. The city council, under pressure from unnamed sources, fast-tracked Maxwell Development's permits despite their founder's arrest. Construction equipment appeared at the edges of the neighborhood, a mechanical army waiting to advance. The Veterans Memorial Park was cordoned off for environmental assessment, its monuments already tagged for removal. Sarah discovered that her nursing license was under investigation based on anonymous complaints. Her supervisor, apologetic but firm, placed her on indefinite administrative leave. The message was clear: the system they'd fought against wasn't just one corrupt developer, but an entrenched network willing to destroy lives to maintain its power. Marcus watched his mother's strength waver for the first time since his father's death. Late one night, he found her in the kitchen crying over a stack of overdue bills. Their fight for justice had cost them nearly everything: savings depleted, careers threatened, safety compromised. The victory they'd celebrated had turned to ashes in their mouths. The final blow came in the form of a legal notice. Maxwell Development, despite its founder's imprisonment, had filed a defamation lawsuit against the Colonel, the Thompson family, and several other Pine Grove residents. The potential damages would bankrupt them all, and their evidence, what remained of it, might not be admissible in civil court. Even Tommy Martinez's technical skills couldn't protect them anymore. Their communications were compromised, their phones tapped, their emails intercepted. The truth they'd fought to expose was being buried under an avalanche of legal threats, financial pressure, and systematic intimidation. The Colonel, when briefly conscious, seemed to carry the weight of this failure in his eyes. "History repeats," he whispered to Marcus during one lucid moment. "Your father, I couldn't save him either." The words carried the bitter taste of defeat, a veteran's recognition that sometimes the enemy was too deeply entrenched to defeat. Community meetings, once filled with determination and unity, dwindled to a handful of diehards. The Martinez family, facing deportation threats, reluctantly put their house on the market. Mrs. Chen, her restaurant closed indefinitely, began packing 40 years of memories into cardboard boxes. The spirit that had defined their resistance was breaking, one family at a time. Marcus stood at his bedroom window each night, watching the neighborhood he'd grown up in slowly surrender to fear. The papers he'd saved from the Colonel's house felt like burning coal, their truth too dangerous to reveal but too important to destroy. His father had died protecting this evidence, the Colonel had nearly died preserving it, and now the weight of that legacy rested on his young shoulders. Sarah found him one evening tracing the route of his old paper delivery, as if trying to recapture the innocence of those early morning hours before everything changed. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the hardest part of fighting for what's right is accepting that the cost might be everything we have." The lights of Pine Grove seemed dimmer now, the streets emptier, the silence heavier with unspoken defeats. The fence that had once brought Marcus and the Colonel together stood as a testament to their shattered dreams of justice, its newly repaired boards a bitter reminder of hope destroyed by the machinery of power. The unexpected turn came from an unlikely source. Maxwell's own son, Thomas Maxwell, appeared at Sarah Thompson's door one rainy evening. Unlike his father, Thomas carried himself with a hesitant humility, his expensive suit seeming more like a costume than natural attire. "I've been following my father's documentation for years," he explained, placing a heavy briefcase on their kitchen table. "I think it's time someone finished what David Thompson started." Inside the briefcase lay years of meticulously gathered evidence, offshore account records, internal memos, and surveillance reports that Maxwell had kept on his own colleagues. Thomas had been his father's unwitting confidant, trusted with information because he was considered too weak to ever use it. "I was supposed to take over the company," he said quietly. "Instead, I've spent years documenting everything." The revelation coincided with the Colonel regaining consciousness in the hospital. When Marcus and Sarah visited with the new evidence, James Anderson's eyes lit up with recognition. "Operation Desert Shield," he whispered, connecting the dots. The corruption didn't start with that helicopter crash. It started during the war with missing supplies, inflated contracts. His hands trembled as he reviewed Thomas's documents, but this time with excitement rather than fear. Thomas Maxwell proved to be more than just a source of evidence. As the heir to Maxwell Development, he had access to the company's internal networks. More importantly, he had relationships with board members who'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with the company's tactics. They were fine with aggressive business, he explained, but attempted murder crossed a line. The momentum shifted rapidly. Thomas arranged meetings with federal prosecutors, bypassing local law enforcement entirely. His testimony, combined with the colonel's military expertise and Marcus's gathered evidence, painted a picture of corruption spanning decades. The investigation expanded beyond Pine Grove, reaching into military contracts, veteran benefits, and development projects across multiple states. Sarah's nursing license investigation was suddenly dropped. Mrs. Rivera's son's service record was cleared. The Martinez family's deportation threats vanished. One by one, the pressure points that had been used to silence the community began to disappear. The invisible hand that had seemed so powerful was losing its grip. Media attention returned, this time at a national level. Journalists who specialized in military corruption descended on Pine Grove, drawn by the scope of the story. The community's struggle was reframed not as a local development dispute, but as a symbol of systematic exploitation of veteran communities nationwide. The colonel, growing stronger daily, became a central figure in the investigation. His military records, when fully declassified, revealed a history of attempting to report irregularities, each time blocked by the same network they were now exposing. "Your father wasn't the first to try," he told Marcus. "But thanks to his preparation and your generation's courage, he might be the last one they silenced." Thomas Maxwell's involvement had another unexpected effect. It encouraged others within the corrupt network to come forward. Former employees, military contractors, and even government officials began providing testimony, each piece filling in the massive puzzle that David Thompson had first glimpsed decades ago. Marcus watched as Pine Grove gradually reawakened from its fear-induced paralysis. Veterans who had begun packing their homes now unpacked, their faith in justice cautiously renewed. The construction equipment at the neighborhood's edge disappeared, removed quietly in the night. The military monuments in the park remained untouched, standing as silent witnesses to the community's resilience. One morning, as Marcus helped the colonel with his physical therapy in the hospital garden, James Anderson shared a revelation that brought their journey full circle. "Your father knew," he said, "watching a group of birds scatter and reform in the sky. He knew he might not survive exposing the truth. That's why he spread the evidence so widely, why he trusted so many of us with pieces of the puzzle. He believed that someday someone would be brave enough to put it all together." The old Marine's eyes met Marcus's with a mixture of pride and determination. "He was right about that," the colonel continued. "He just never imagined it would be his own son who would finish what he started." The moment hung between them, heavy with the weight of legacy and the promise of justice finally within reach. The federal investigation moved with unprecedented speed, driven by Thomas Maxwell's insider knowledge and the mountain of evidence collected by Pine Grove's residents. High-ranking military officials were quietly retired. Corporate executives resigned unexpectedly. Each day brought new revelations of how deeply the corruption had penetrated government contracts, veteran services, and urban development projects. Richard Maxwell's arrest had been just the tip of the iceberg. The real power players emerged: generals who had authorized fraudulent contracts, politicians who had buried investigations, bureaucrats who had manipulated veteran benefits for profit. The web of corruption stretched across decades, each strand leading back to the events that had claimed David Thompson's life. The most dramatic moment came when Thomas Maxwell testified before a congressional committee broadcast live across the nation. He spoke of growing up watching his father build an empire on stolen valor and buried truths. "I was raised to believe that power justified everything," he testified, his voice steady. "But spending time in Pine Grove, seeing the real cost of that power, showed me that some profits aren't worth their price." The colonel, now recovered enough to attend the hearings, provided the military context that gave the investigation its full impact. His testimony linked individual cases of corruption to a systematic exploitation of veteran communities nationwide. Pine Grove, he explained, had been just one battlefield in a longer war against those who saw military service as a path to personal profit. Sarah Thompson's role proved crucial in exposing the manipulation of veteran healthcare benefits. Her years of nursing experience, combined with the documentation she'd gathered, revealed how the corrupt network had used medical records to pressure and control veteran residents. Her testimony brought many committee members to tears, particularly when she spoke of caring for veterans who had served alongside her late husband. Marcus found himself at the center of a story that had grown far beyond their small community. News outlets celebrated him as a symbol of young activism and intergenerational justice. But it was his quieter moments helping the Colonel with physical therapy, sorting through case files with Thomas Maxwell, listening to veterans share long-buried stories that felt most meaningful. The evidence his father had hidden proved to be the key to understanding the entire operation. David Thompson hadn't just discovered individual crimes, he had uncovered a methodology for exploiting military communities that had been replicated across the country. His final mission hadn't been about one corrupt officer, it had been about exposing an entire system of corruption. As the truth emerged, Pine Grove began to heal. Mrs. Chin reopened her restaurant, now a gathering place for veterans sharing their stories with investigating journalists. The Martinez family unpacked their boxes, their home secure once more. Mrs. Rivera's son received a long overdue promotion, his service record cleared of manufactured blemishes. The Colonel's recovery accelerated as justice took its course. His tremor subsided, replaced by the steady hands of a Marine reclaiming his purpose. He worked closely with Thomas Maxwell, their unlikely partnership bridging the gap between corporate knowledge and military honor. Together, they created a framework for identifying and preventing similar exploitation of veteran communities. The transformation of Pine Grove became a model for communities nationwide. Veterans in other cities began examining their local development projects, looking for patterns they had learned to recognize from Pine Grove's experience. The predatory practices that had once seemed unstoppable were now exposed to the light, losing their power in the face of informed resistance. Thomas Maxwell used his inheritance to establish a legal defense fund for veteran communities facing similar battles. The first case they took on was reviewing denied benefits for families of service members lost in classified operations, starting with a full investigation of the mission that had claimed David Thompson's life. One morning, as Marcus walked his old paper route with the Colonel, they passed the fence that had started it all. "Your father would be proud," James said, running his hand along the weathered wood. "Not just of exposing the truth, but of how you've helped rebuild what they tried to destroy." Marcus nodded, understanding that some victories weren't just about defeating an enemy, they were about strengthening the bonds that held communities together. 1 year after Thomas Maxwell's congressional testimony, Pine Grove gathered again in the Veterans Memorial Park. This time the occasion was both a victory celebration and a rededication ceremony. The park, now protected by federal historic status, had been expanded to include a new monument, a simple black granite wall bearing the names of veterans who had fought corruption alongside their military service. David Thompson's name held a special place on that wall, his sacrifice finally acknowledged in full. The classified mission that had claimed his life was now declassified, his role as a whistleblower officially recognized. Sarah stood before the gathering, her nurse's uniform replaced by a blue dress, and shared the story she'd held inside for so many years. "My husband believed that serving your country doesn't end when you take off the uniform," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "He taught me that courage sometimes means standing alone against a system you once trusted. But thanks to this community, our son never had to stand alone." Marcus, standing beside her in his graduation robes, felt the weight of his father's legacy not as a burden but as a foundation. The Colonel, fully recovered and standing straight as ever, had been instrumental in creating a national veteran protection program. Named the Thompson-Anderson Initiative, it provided legal and financial support to military communities facing development pressure. "We learned in Pine Grove that the strongest defense isn't walls or weapons," he told the assembled crowd. "It's the bonds between neighbors who refuse to be silenced." Thomas Maxwell's transformation from reluctant heir to advocate for veteran rights had inspired others in the corporate world to examine their consciences. His legal defense fund had already prevented 3 other communities from suffering Pine Grove's fate. "My father built an empire by exploiting heroes," he acknowledged during his speech. "I hope to spend the rest of my life helping protect them instead." The changes in Pine Grove went beyond monuments and programs. Mrs. Chin's restaurant now hosted monthly veteran support group meetings where the healing power of shared meals and stories helped ease the burden of long-carried secrets. The Martinez family had started a community legal aid clinic specializing in veteran housing rights. Mrs. Rivera's garden, once threatened by bulldozers, had become a therapy space for veterans dealing with PTSD. Marcus, Accepted to law school with a focus on veteran advocacy, found his calling in continuing the work that had begun with a broken fence. The colonel had become more than a mentor. He was family now, filling the role of grandfather at graduations and celebrations. Their weekly discussions had evolved from strategy sessions to deeper conversations about service, justice, and the true meaning of victory. Sarah's position at the VA hospital had been restored with honors, and she now headed a new department focused on identifying and preventing systematic abuse of veteran benefits. Her experiences had transformed her from a grieving widow into a powerful advocate for military families, her quiet strength and inspiration to others facing similar battles. The fence that had first brought Marcus and the colonel together still stood, now covered in climbing roses planted by neighborhood children. It no longer marked a boundary between properties but served as a symbol of how barriers could become bridges when people chose to reach across them. Veterans walking past would often stop to share stories, their memories of struggle and triumph becoming part of Pine Grove's living history. One evening, as the community gathered for their regular potluck dinner in the park, Marcus noticed something remarkable. The faces around him showed no trace of the fear and defeat that had once threatened to destroy Pine Grove. Instead, he saw strength in their laughter, resilience in their shared memories, and hope in their plans for the future. The neighborhood had not just survived its darkest hour, it had emerged as a beacon for others facing similar battles. The colonel, catching Marcus's thoughtful expression, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Your father saw the beginning of this fight," he said quietly. "But you, son, you've helped us all see how it should end. Not with victory over an enemy, but with the triumph of community over corruption, of truth over power, of hope over fear." The final chapter of Pine Grove's transformation came with the establishment of the David Thompson Memorial Scholarship. Created through a partnership between Thomas Maxwell's Foundation and the veteran community, it supported children of military whistleblowers in pursuing careers in law, journalism, or public service. Marcus, now in his first year of law school, served on the selection committee, helping identify young people who shared his father's commitment to truth and justice. The impact of Pine Grove's resistance rippled far beyond their small community. Congressional hearings led to new legislation protecting veteran homeowners from predatory development. Military contracts underwent stricter oversight, with special attention to the patterns of corruption first identified in David Thompson's hidden evidence. The Thompson-Anderson Initiative became a model for communities nationwide, its success proving that organized resistance could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Sarah Thompson found unexpected healing in mentoring military widows navigating the complex systems her husband had fought to expose. Her quiet strength and deep understanding of both personal loss and systematic injustice made her a powerful advocate for families seeking truth and recognition. David always said that service was about protecting others. She often reminded those who sought her help. Sometimes that protection means standing up to the very system you served. The colonel's retirement finally felt complete, not through withdrawal from the world, but through fuller engagement with it. His trembling hand steadied permanently as he focused on teaching young activists the strategies that had saved Pine Grove. The nightmares that had haunted him for decades faded, replaced by the satisfaction of seeing justice served and communities strengthened. Mrs. Chen expanded her restaurant, adding a community center where veterans could gather, share stories, and find support. The walls displayed photographs documenting Pine Grove's journey from threatened neighborhood to national symbol of resistance. Young activists studying community organizing made pilgrimages to learn from those who had stood their ground against seemingly insurmountable odds. On the anniversary of David Thompson's death, Pine Grove began a new tradition. The community gathered at dawn, retracing Marcus's old paper route. At each stop, veterans shared stories of resistance and resilience, teaching the next generation about the price of justice and the power of united communities. The walk ended at the memorial wall, where fresh flowers appeared mysteriously every morning, a reminder that some victories belonged not just to the living but to those who had sacrificed everything for truth. Thomas Maxwell, transformed by his role in exposing his father's empire, dedicated himself to identifying and preventing similar exploitation nationwide. His insider's knowledge, combined with a genuine commitment to redemption, made him a powerful ally for vulnerable communities. "My father taught me that power corrupts," he often said in his speeches, "but Pine Grove taught me that courage heals." The fence that started it all became a local landmark, its story told and retold as an example of how small acts of kindness could spark movements for justice. Marcus and the colonel maintained it together, their weekly maintenance sessions becoming opportunities for reflection on how far they'd come and how far they still had to go in protecting veteran communities. As Marcus progressed through law school, specializing in veteran advocacy law, he carried with him not just his father's legacy, but the collective strength of a community that had refused to be silenced. The lessons of Pine Grove about courage, unity, and the power of truth shaped his approach to justice. Victory isn't always about winning battles, he would tell his fellow students. Sometimes it's about building something stronger from the ruins of what you had to tear down. The final message of Pine Grove's story echoed in every small victory that followed: that true strength lies not in power over others, but in standing together against injustice, that healing comes not from forgetting, but from transforming pain into purpose. And that the greatest legacy we can leave is not the battles we fight, but the communities we build in their aftermath. As the sun set over the memorial park, casting long shadows across the names of those who had fought for truth, Pine Grove stood as a testament to the enduring power of ordinary people who refused to let justice remain just a dream. Dear friends, if this story of courage, justice, and community touched your heart, please join our storytelling family by hitting that subscribe button. Your support means everything to our team, who works tirelessly to bring these powerful narratives to life. Share this video with your loved ones. Let them experience the inspiring journey of Marcus, Colonel Anderson, and Pine Grove's brave community. Don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Should we explore Part 2? What happened after Pine Grove's victory? Let us know if you'd like to discover the next chapter in this remarkable story.